This fourth Superman film was a cheap, truncated effort that ended up turning Kal-El into the Man of Cheese.
Unfinished, cheap, nonsensical, and just downright bad.
Let's talk about Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. Why?
This is the laziest damn superhero movie I've ever seen.
Superman 4, The Quest for Peace is one of the worst movies ever made. I genuinely do not think there's any debate.
Guys, it's really not that bad. I recently watched Superman 4 as a part of a Superman movie marathon with my brother, and it's definitely not good, but I would say there's more I like in it than I dislike in it. But apparently, I'm the only guy in the world who thinks it's underrated, so I felt it was my duty to create a love letter video to Superman 4, or at least as much of a love letter video as you can give a movie like this while still being critical. But before we dive in, let's do a quick 1-minute recap of how the Christopher Reeve Superman movies reached this point. Superman 1 is the first modern superhero movie ever. It's acclaimed, beloved, and every superhero movie since steals a lot of the ideas it started. It's the baby of director Richard Donner, who wanted to stray away from things like the Adam West Batman show to do a more serious and mature portrayal of comic book stories, while also keeping the campy, cartoony charm of Superman. It's quite a grand, epic movie that spans over Superman's whole origin story, and was sort of intended as only a part 1, since Superman 2 was being filmed right alongside it. After some financial and behind-the-scenes issues, Richard Donner was fired from 2 after he had already filmed 75% of it. In came Richard Lester, who managed to generally finish off Donner's vision and stick the landing, while also controversially adding some of his silly comedic charm to the movie. Donner wasn't happy with Lester's additions and reshoots, so years later he released his own cut of the movie. Sound familiar? Superman 3 was entirely Lester, and was basically a screwball comedy that happened to have Superman in it. This movie was less well received than 1 and 2, and Reeve said he'd only return for a 4th if he gets tons of money and if the movie's plot revolves around nuclear disarmament. Both came to fruition, and we ended up with this. Now, there's one important part of this whole story which is great context for why I think Superman 4 is underrated. To put it simply, Superman 3 definitely isn't liked, but it kind of has the reputation of being the Batman Forever to Superman 4's Batman and Robin, meaning that the two movies share a lot of the same flaws, but at the end of the day, 3 is at least watchable while 4 is an embarrassment, which is just wrong. Superman 3 centers around Gus, a goofy computer hacker who teams up with Lex Luthor, Ross Webster, to defeat Superman. On this journey of theirs, they accidentally create a synthetic kryptonite that turns Superman evil. Now, I do actually like the core message of this movie, the idea that Superman doesn't have super goodness, instead it's Clark that makes Superman a good guy and a hero, meaning any of us can be just as great as him. However, that cool idea is just bogged down by a meandering, dull, unfunny movie that barely even has Superman in it. Most of the screen time is Richard Pryor shenanigans, and not even good Richard Pryor shenanigans. It's very obvious that the creators of this movie have never read a Superman story and don't care about the character at all. Also, keep in mind that the supporting cast of 1 and 2 refused to return for a 3rd if Donner didn't direct. So this film only gives Lois 12 lines and chooses to replace Lex Luthor with a guy who's identically written but lacks almost any charisma that the original actor had. It is a painful movie that sets up a lot of things and makes you believe it's all going to come together at some point, but in reality it only gets worse and worse.
Bermuda.
Superman 4, I think, fixes the majority of issues I have with 3, probably because Lester was replaced by Sidney J. Furie, no offense. Lester has a cool career and was significantly more successful than Sidney, but I just don't think his vibe suited Superman. The most obvious improvement in 4 is that the original supporting cast are back. Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor is again the main villain. Now, I will say that I don't love how Lex Luthor seems to be the only Superman villain Superman movies care about, along with maybe Zod, because I think behind Batman, Spider-Man, and probably The Flash, Superman has the best rogues gallery. But we never ever see characters like Brainiac, Bizarro, Metallo, Parasite, Lobo, Manchester Black, Toyman, Mr. Mix, Silver Banshee, Livewire, or even Microwave Man on the big screen, which is unfortunate. However, all of that aside, seeing Gene Hackman again after 2 hours and 5 minutes of Gus Gorman and Ross Webster is a relief. Also, call me crazy, but Lex's plan to sink California in the first movie was a little too ridiculous for me, while his war profiteering and the creation of Nuclear Man found here is strangely more believable, and the beats he takes to complete his goals in 4 are very logical, even if they're definitely still out there. Another thing you can call me crazy about is that I like his sidekick here more than I like his sidekicks in any previous movie. I do think the biggest flaw in 1 is the Team Lex banter. They're all fun, but they just make Lex seem less threatening, and I think they're simultaneously not fleshed out enough but also given too much screen time. Otis is obviously the best, but I think his bumbling slapstick feels a little out of place in this universe. Good thing this franchise never chose to make a movie entirely of bumbling slapstick. I don't think Lenny is like the second coming of Christ or anything, but they gave him the right amount of screen time, and despite him being very silly, is actually useful to Lex, while the previous sidekicks all kind of held him back. And it's just more believable that Lex's idiot helper would be an enthusiastic nephew, rather than people he chose to hire despite them not being great at their job. Also, this franchise was in dire need of a surfer dude character who looks like he's from the future, played by a Pete Davidson knockoff.
You know what this means, Uncle Art? What? We're gonna be parents.
Another major character who returned is Lois. I will say that a lot of the time she feels a little pointless and flanderized, and she is usually a major part in some of the weakest scenes in this movie, but Margot Kidder's performance is just so charismatic that I don't care how badly written she can sometimes be, I guess. Oh yes, also Jimmy's here. Lois and Jimmy take up an interesting slither of this movie, and I think now is the right time to talk about the plot of this thing. There's sort of three things going on at once. The A plot is basically World War III starts, and Superman tries to end it by getting nations to disarm their nukes. The B plot is Lex profiting off the flaws in Superman's plan, as well as creating Nuclear Man. And the C plot is the Daily Planet being taken over by an evil journalist. Not a journalist that is secretly evil, but instead a guy who happens to be immoral with his journalism.
Oh, Clark, you always overreact. It won't be that terrible.
Hopefully very terrible, Miss Lane.
One of the biggest issues with this movie is just how disconnected these three plot lines are. They all have the connection of being related to Clark, a bare minimum which Superman 3 didn't manage to do, but I just don't think that's enough to maintain the momentum of this movie. In these types of films, it's always best when it feels like all the plot lines are barreling towards the same point, rather than bouncing around a ton the way this movie does. That being said, it juggles its plot lines significantly better than a Spider-Man 3 or The Amazing Spider-Man 2 or whatever. Let's talk about that C plot first, just to get it out of the way. It's probably the least engaging storyline out of the three because it's the most cuttable, but it's not offensive in any way. The new character of David Warfield, subtle name, is decent, and his role of the Daily Planet sort of acts like a Daily Bugle with the way it just bashes Superman for the whole movie. I like it, but the storyline doesn't really go anywhere. For the entire movie, it's just newspaper write bad thing, and then in the final 10 minutes of the movie, Perry White overthrows Warfield's rule. That being said, I like how Perry got a heroic moment. It fits into the hopeful theme that the good of humanity wins in the end. And I like how they chose to give the Daily Planet a real bit of drama in the final Christopher Reeve movie. However, this C plot does also have a secret D plot that sadly I don't like, aka any romantic scene in this movie. They try to do this weird love triangle thing, which just sucks. I don't care about Lacey Warfield at all. But if they really wanted to go the love triangle route, they should have continued the best part of Superman 3, which is the return of Clark's high school sweetheart, Lana Lang. Definitely feels like that's what they wanted to do, but for whatever reason, Lana's actress didn't want to come back, so they just settled for this. Whatever. There's a Lacey-Lois double date scene where Lacey's with Clark and Lois is with Superman, which sounds like a great setup, but the scene really doesn't need to exist, and the gag is just so dragged out. It's the only part of this movie that I would probably skip over if I ever watched it again, just because it's so long. Oh yes, also, in terms of the romance, there's this one scene where Superman is in a bad mood, so he reveals his secret identity to Lois just to see what it's like, and then after 10 minutes amnesia kisses her like he did in 2, because he doesn't want to deal with all that. What? What a waste of time. Everyone hates the amnesia kiss in 2. Why do it again? I understand the purpose of the sequence. Superman wants to feel free for once, but that is literally the worst way they could have done it. That scene does have this gem of a moment though.
Clark, things aren't that bad. Clark, stop!
Let's move on to the main part of the movie, which is Superman's quest for peace. I think Superman trying to end the Cold War / World War III is such a good story idea. Superman's mission is trying to stop Earth, his second home, from having the same fate as Krypton, his first home, and he's a person who believes there's good in everyone. So this is a chance for him to prove it on a global scale. Can the morality of man overpower the divide between the powers of the world and man's want to play God with these weapons of mass destruction? Along with that question, it was just extremely relevant when it came out, and if done maturely and sensitively, could have maybe caused real change and be a landmark in Superman stories the way Superman smashes the Klan is, for example. Now, is it done well? Yeah. Superman's initial plan for creating world peace is pretty stupid. He doesn't do any real negotiating or strategizing. He basically just hangs out in space waiting for missiles to be fired, and then he just grabs them and throws them into the sun. No peace is accomplished from this. It's just Superman going, don't do that. Don't do it! Or hoping that eventually the countries shooting these missiles will get bored of trying. The movie does actually expose the stupidity of this, since Lex profits off selling new missiles to these countries. And he also creates nuclear nuclear man by putting Superman's DNA into one of the missiles, which obviously once thrown into the sun creates a living being. However, despite the movie acknowledging how dumb Superman is, it doesn't take away from the fact that Superman shouldn't be this dumb, and it's a very naive way of approaching the issue. The movie could have actually leaned into an arc here, where Superman at first tries this method because he sees no other option, but then learns that it's not getting him anywhere and he should be less authoritarian about it. There's a chance the movie was trying to do this, but they really didn't make it obvious enough. Also, there's an argument for the fact that countries having these missiles actually causes more peace, because no country wants to fight since they don't want nuclear destruction. Whether you agree with that or not is up to you, but I think it's an angle that this movie shouldn't have neglected discussing. But maybe this belief is more popular now though than it was when the world was actually in the Cold War. One thing I do appreciate though is the fact that for the most part this movie isn't US propaganda. It's entirely about peace, and Superman is seen saving a diverse batch of people all around the world, not just saving the people of Metropolis. This movie really shoots itself in the foot though, because the second half of it almost entirely forgets the peace messages and just devolves into flying guys punching each other over and over once Nuclear Man is created by Lex. While Nuclear Man definitely hurts the quality of this movie, he doesn't hurt my enjoyment of it, because honestly I don't mind him. He has the reputation of being like the worst superhero movie villain ever, but come on, he's just a goofy brute. Whether you think he's bad for the story or not, you can't lie that he increases the ironic entertainment value of this movie. If you seriously watch any Nuclear Man scene, straight face, cross arms, shaking your head saying, this movie ruins Superman, then you just need to liven up in my opinion. Nuclear Man, for no reason at all, has the voice of Lex Luthor. That is just perfectly done.
I am the father now. You have my voice.
The only part of Nuclear Man that I genuinely dislike is how his weakness, the fact that he only has powers under sunlight, is so obvious and therefore so easy to counter, and the movie doesn't even try to cover it up. In the scene where he's introduced, they literally say outright how he's going to be defeated.
He gets his energy from the sun. Without it, he's like you at night. Useless. That's his vulnerability. That's the only way he can be stopped.
Apparently there was going to be a subplot of sorts where he was in love with Lacey Warfield or something, but they chose to cut it, so him then kidnapping her in the third act makes little to no sense. But I don't mind, I just block out anything Lacey related in this film. Nuclear Man isn't some superhero movie anomaly. He's basically just a sillier version of Doomsday from Batman vs Superman. And also the idea of Lex creating a brawn over brains Superman-esque creature is literally just bizarro. You know what, maybe this movie should have done Bizarro, I don't know. But also Nuclear Man is so tailored to the story that I think he's irreplaceable. After Superman defeats him, he drops him into a power plant, and since he's made from the sun, he ends up being a renewable resource for the whole world, meaning Superman in one day solved world peace and climate change. What a great movie. Actually, he doesn't solve world peace, which I think is a great decision. You'd expect a movie like this to have a super unrealistic happy ending, but in actuality, despite it failing along the way, I think the final message this movie chooses to say is a great one. There's a scene at the end where Lex is like, so Superman, did you create world peace or something? And Superman responds with,
no, Luthor, it's as it always was, on the brink, with good fighting evil. See you in 20.
Which I think is a very mature, grounded yet optimistic and very Superman way of presenting the quest for peace. Also, I don't want to bring up the obvious, but Christopher Reeve's performance is just amazing. He's a perfect Superman, he's a perfect Clark, he shows so much range, and he's the only guy really trying in this movie. No matter how good an actor's performance is in a superhero role, I feel they're pretty replaceable because superheroes just lend themselves to being reimagined a ton of times. However, I think Reeve and Robert Downey Jr. are the only two exceptions to that rule, because every aspect of them is just perfect for the characters they're playing. I am rooting for David though. James Gunn's Superman is my most anticipated movie ever. One huge thing I've refused to talk about for this whole video is the movie's effects. Yes, they're terrible, even for the time, but I can use my imagination, and they also have a charm. Keep in mind that the movie's budget was slashed in half because Canon Films was losing tons of money at the time, leading to horrible blue screening, filming complex scenes in the cheapest, easiest way, and certain VFX shots being repeated over and over. It's just sad, really. With other movies, I'd probably let things like that affect my rating of them more, but here it's water under the bridge. Even good CGI from this era looks bad by today's standards, so I can appreciate the movie despite its visual flaws. Now, is Superman 4 good? Probably not, but do I love it? Yes. At its best, Superman 4 is underrated, and at its worst, it's so bad it's good. It's just a very entertaining combo, and I think it's a better watch than a lot of other superhero movies, and I think it has a lot of potential. There's a universe out there where this movie has Lana Lang, and good effects, and some scenes and characters are cut, and the peace theme is handled better. And in that universe, everyone's able to see this movie the way I see it. Unfortunately, that universe will never be, but I hope this video was in some way a window into that world.
And there will be peace. There will be peace when the people of the world want it so badly that their governments will have no choice but to give it to them. I just wish you could all see the Earth the way that I see it. Because when you really look at it, it's just one world.